Summarize what we've seen. For categorical variables, we can always use bar or column graphs, and I don't really care what we call them, and I don't really care if you make the bars vertical or horizontal. That's kind of an aesthetic choice, and it also may depend on how effectively you're going to convey your message with one or the other. So you can tinker with that. You can use pie charts, but only if you've got all the parts of a common whole, as we did with the Duolingo words. For quantitative variables, we have a few more options. We're not going to use a pie chart for quantitative variables. It's just typically not done. But you can use a bar or column graph, which is particularly useful when you have a smaller number of input values, especially if the input values are categorical. You can use line graphs when the input values are categorical, and you certainly should use line graphs if the input values are quantitative, like time, for example. But those line graphs are only going to work if you have a single observation for each value of the input. So, for example, if there's a single number for time, right? Or a single number for, what was the other example we looked at, for different types of donations. If, on the other hand, you have two variables and whichever one is your input, whichever one is your output, there's possibly more than one output value for a given input value. For example, two different counties may have the same poverty rate but different obesity rates. Then a scatter plot is called for. Okay? That's a summary of how to select which graph you're going to use. I want to conclude this section by talking about a few helpful tips to make sure your graphs are decent. So these helpful tips are, first, don't include totals in your graphs because that distorts the graph. And second, avoid using 3D figures. I know it's tempting because they look kind of cool, but they're actually distracting to your audience. Let's look at a couple of examples to illustrate these. First, let's take a look at the chart we made for tracking our donations for Our Brother's Keeper, the Big Rapids homeless shelter. So we made this bar chart, and it looks great, right? I mean, it needs a title. We'll talk about that in the next video, which will begin the next section. But this is very readable otherwise, right? You can tell what's going on. It tells you a message. It says where we're doing well, where we're not doing well, where we need to do some work, all right? But let's suppose we had included totals in there. So first of all, let's put totals in. So as before, label your rows or columns. For totals, we use, I don't know how hard it is to see, but this auto sum up here in the upper right. Notice that sigma, that's going to come back in chapter 2, but I'm just going to hit it for now. That adds everything. And then I'll do the same with our targets. And now, suppose I make this graph. And I select the same kind of a bar chart. Notice how this is not as useful. In particular, this was the first 5 categories were what we were interested in. What's happening is the totals are large enough because they're the sums of everything that it distorts the scale, so it's hard to see what's going on in the first several columns. Now, you may care about the totals. You may want to emphasize that. If you're preparing a dashboard for your board of directors as your treasurer, you may have to decide whether you want to emphasize the individual categories, as I showed you before, or if you want to emphasize totals, just make a graph with totals as such. And there's a perfectly good graph. We would have to make some edits here to designate that this is what's been collected through August. This is what's been collected through, this is our target, sorry, but this does the job. You may want to do both, but you also have to be wary of overwhelming your audience. Let's go over and take a look at what happens with the pie chart. Here is the pie chart for the frequency for the number of words that are in each category in Duolingo for me. Standard pie chart, needs some labels. We'll talk about that in the next video. But what would happen if I included the total? pause this video for a moment and predict. Okay, I gave you a little space to pause. Hopefully you paused, thought about it a little bit. Let's make the graph. Here is the new graph. The total is half of the entire graph. And the part we're interested in is the right half. The left half doesn't interest us at all. It doesn't tell us anything. And what's going on here is you've effectively doubled the size of the pie, because everything on the right, everything as categorized, adds up to the exact same whole as the total. So we've doubled the whole, and the total is automatically half. So that's not very useful. So we'll go back to the old graph, and now I want to show you why the second recommendation to avoid 3D charts. Well, to get 3D charts, we have to go into pie graphs. Suppose we already know we want to use a pie graph. Here's our 3D pie graph. Oops, I included the total, right? So it's even worse, double problem. So hold on, I'm going to delete that. And there we go. And now we'll make the 3D pie graph that only uses data that's useful, right? So that's what it looks like. You can kind of get what you want out of it, but it's distracting is what's going on. The 3D graph is just very distracting and it doesn't add anything. So just avoid using 3D graphs. That concludes the basics of graphs and charts. In the next section, we're going to look at some more advanced features of graphs and charts, and we're going to begin by how to make some modifications in Excel.